The letter arrived at sunrise stamped with a black seal that read, "Sentence of Death." Homeowners Association President Lenora Voss had built her own courtroom-appointed board members as judges and convicted Grant Mercer of the crime of refusing to surrender his private land. By noon, armed guards surrounded his farmhouse, cameras rolled, and neighbors were ordered to witness the execution of his property rights. Lenora believed fear would make Grant kneel. Instead, he walked into her fake courthouse carrying one sealed federal warrant. Before sunset, the 12 people chanting guilty would be photographed again, this time in handcuffs facing real judges, real evidence, and decades behind bars. Grant Mercer woke at 47 minutes past 5 in the morning to the sound of metal striking his front gate. He was 46 years old, a former federal contract fraud investigator who had spent 2 decades reading the fine print that other people signed without looking. He lived alone on 94 acres of stone and open pasture that had belonged to his family since long before anyone had ever heard the name Briarwood Crest. When he walked outside in the gray light, he found a black steel box chained to his fence, and inside it was a thick folder stamped with a seal that read Briarwood Crest Community Order Court. The first page declared that the defendant, Grant Mercer, had been sentenced to a civil death for crimes against the community. The document did not claim to end his life in the ordinary sense. Instead, it defined civil death through a list of punishments that read like the fantasy of someone who had never once been told no. The list stripped him of the right to use the private road that crossed the edge of his own land, cut his water and electricity froze. Any business he ran from the property seized his vehicles, voided his ownership of the deed, banished him from the region, forbade every resident from speaking to him or trading with him, and authorized the association's security division to use what it called necessary force to carry the sentence out. Grant understood immediately that this was not another threatening letter of the kind he had received for 6 months. This was a homeowners association that had built something resembling a government complete with verdicts, enforcement, and a chain of command. A small camera had been wedged into the top of the box, clearly meant to capture his reaction for whoever was watching on the other end. Grant did not raise his voice. He lifted the folder toward the lens and said, in a voice as calm as a man reading a grocery list, that they had just turned a property dispute into evidence of a federal crime. The dispute had a history, and it went back 6 months to the afternoon. Lenora Voss had first offered Grant $900,000 for his land. He had refused because beneath his pastures sat a rare mineral seam and a spring that fed half the wells in the valley, including several inside Briarwood Crest itself. After the refusal came a campaign so relentless it might have seemed comic if it had not been so calculated. Fake membership invoices arrived, demanding dues he had never agreed to pay. He was fined for the color of his roof, fined for owning horses, informed that the private road crossing his eastern boundary now belonged to community management, and finally told he would need to surrender 40 acres to make room for a resort expansion the board had approved without him. Every time Grant answered with a deed, a survey, or a county record proving her claims false, Lenora did not back down. She simply invented a new rule, confident that persistence alone would eventually wear him down the way water wears down stone. He turned to the final page of the folder and found the date the sentence would be carried out, and it was noon that same day. Moments later, his phone lit up with a video message sent directly from Lenora. She stood inside a converted clubhouse room built to resemble a courtroom, dressed in a black robe, with 11 other board members arranged behind her like a jury waiting to be told what to think. She announced to the small camera that by noon, Grant Mercer would cease to exist legally within their community. Grant zoomed into the frame behind her and recognized the seal hanging on the wall as an unauthorized copy of the county courthouse insignia, right down to the eagle's crooked wing. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had not used in 7 years, and on the other end, Deputy United States Marshal Tessa Rowland answered on the second ring, asking what could possibly be serious enough for him to call federal law enforcement before breakfast. Grant told her they had just sentenced him to death using a counterfeit court seal, and Tessa told him not to move and not to warn anyone. As she spoke, Grant watched 3 unmarked security vehicles turning up his driveway, and he said quietly that it might already be too late because the execution squad had arrived. 3 weeks earlier, in a closed meeting that excluded ordinary residents, Lenora had told the board that the real court system was too slow and too often sided with people who defied the association. Her attorney, Everett Rourke, a man who had spent 30 years drafting language designed to sound legal without ever actually being legal, presented a plan he called the Briarwood Judicial Autonomy Program. Lenora would serve as presiding officer. 5 board members would sit as jurors. Wade Hollister, the vice president who also owned a private security firm, would command enforcement, and Corinne Maddox, the treasurer, would manage seized assets, and the remaining members would serve as witnesses and rubber stamps for whatever verdict Lenora wanted. They anchored the entire scheme to an old bylaw permitting internal mediation sessions, a clause Everett twisted until it bore no resemblance to its original purpose. Lenora spent association funds on judicial robes, a witness stand, a wooden gavel, a metal community seal cameras for a live broadcast, and plastic restraints for the enforcement team, converting a clubhouse meeting room into something that looked disturbingly close to an actual courtroom. Bethany Sloan, the association secretary and the person tasked with recording minutes for this invented court, objected the moment she heard the phrase, "civil death sentence," spoken aloud in a planning meeting. Lenora waved the concern away, insisting they were not killing anyone, only erasing what she called a resident's economic existence within the community. In truth, the first and most important target of this fabricated system had always been Grant Mercer, whose land contained something far more valuable than the moral high ground Lenora pretended to occupy. A summons had technically been mailed to him weeks earlier, but Grant never appeared since the document originated from no legitimate court on record. Lenora treated his absence as an admission of guilt and read a list of charges into the record that included rebellion against the community, occupying strategic land damaging property values, refusing to recognize the association's supreme authority, and endangering what she called the shared vision for the neighborhood's future. None of those charges existed anywhere in criminal law, and the maps she presented as evidence had clearly been altered to redraw his property inside the association's boundary. A detail Bethany noticed, but did not yet dare to report. After the mock proceeding concluded, Corinne handed Lenora a preliminary agreement from a company called Red Summit Minerals, which had offered $14 million for the right to extract the mineral seam beneath Grant's land on the sole condition that the association gain control of the Batten property within 30 days. Lenora had already accepted $2 million up front, and if the deal collapsed, the board would owe the money back along with a penalty 3 times its size. That single financial pressure explained everything because it meant Lenora could not afford to wait for a real court to move at a real court's pace. Back in the present, the 3 security vehicles stopped outside Grant's gate, and Wade climbed out with 7 uniformed men behind him reading aloud, an execution order that demanded Grant surrender his house keys, his vehicle titles, and the property itself, sign away his ownership and leave, without taking any of his documents. Grant stood behind the gate and asked Wade for the state case number attached to the order, and Wade had no answer. He asked for the name of any judge appointed by the state, and Wade only pointed at Lenora's signature at the bottom of the page. Grant informed the men calmly that every word of this exchange was being recorded, and Wade responded by ordering his men to cut through the chain. As bolt cutters bit into the gate, Grant spoke through an outdoor speaker and told them they were committing an organized break-in on camera. Wade sneered and said nobody would ever see that footage, and one of his men strode over to the visible camera mounted on the fence post and smashed it to pieces. What Wade did not realize was that the destroyed camera was a decoy, and 6 others hidden throughout the property were streaming live footage directly to Tessa Rowland's field office, capturing everything with a clarity Lenora's people had never bothered to anticipate. At exactly noon, Lenora began her broadcast of what she called the execution. She had summoned more than 60 adult homeowners to the clubhouse, framing the gathering as a day to protect the future of Briarwood, and no one was permitted to bring a phone inside. On a large screen, footage streamed live from a camera clipped to Wade's uniform as his team breached the gate and moved onto the property. Lenora told the crowd that Grant Mercer was a threat the community had already tried and convicted, and she wanted every resident to understand precisely what happened to anyone who defied the board. Inside the farmhouse, the security team dragged out a generator-marked equipment with red spray paint, chained the wheels of his truck, and nailed a sign to his front door declaring the property seized by the Homeowners Association. They even built a small wooden frame intending to burn a copy of his deed on camera, as a symbol of his defeat. A piece of theater meant to humiliate him in front of every neighbor watching the broadcast. Grant did not resist with force. He retreated calmly to his equipment shed carrying a metal case, and as the men worked, he began asking each of them simple, pointed questions. Who had given the order? Who was paying them? Did they know the land did not belong to the association? Who authorized the use of force against him? Wade kept repeating that Lenora Voss was the supreme judge of the community, and every answer he gave was captured on audio that would later prove devastating in court. When Grant opened his metal case, it held no weapon at all, only copies of his deed, a full chain of title, and every threatening letter the association had sent him over the previous 6 months. Wade snatched the case and threw the papers into the mud, and Grant looked directly into Wade's body camera and thanked him for confirming on the record an intentional destruction of ownership evidence. Wade switched the camera off in frustration, unaware that the device kept recording to its internal memory regardless of what he believed he had disabled. Back at the clubhouse, the signal cut out at that same moment, and Lenora assumed Grant had resisted. She issued a new order authorizing the arrest of the defendant, and when Bethany reminded her that the association had no legal power to detain anyone, Lenora pulled her aside and threatened to charge her with conspiring alongside Grant. It was in that moment that Bethany understood she was being groomed as the fall guy the instant this scheme collapsed, and she quietly began photographing pages from Lenora's order log using her phone. Wade and two men marched Grant across his own yard and bound his wrists with plastic restraints, and Grant offered no resistance, asking only whether they had actually built a jail, to which Wade laughed and said Lenora had prepared for every kind of rebel imaginable. That detail changed the scale of the crime completely because it meant this was no longer only about forged paperwork, but about the secret detention of human beings, and Tessa, listening through a small transmitter hidden in Grant's belt buckle, now had every justification she needed to move in. Grant asked her to wait, wanting first to know how many other victims had passed through that basement, and where the association kept its records. As he was led toward the clubhouse, he glimpsed a row of locked garages behind the building, and through a gap in one door, he saw 3 vehicles belonging to residents who had abruptly moved away the year before, one of them still carrying its license plate and the personal belongings of its owner. They took Grant down by service elevator into a basement behind a fire door, where 3 converted rooms had been fitted with electronic locks, cameras, chairs, bolted to the floor, constant overhead lighting, a speaker playing recorded messages from Lenora, and stacks of what the association called compliance interview files. Names and dates had been scratched into the walls by former occupants, every one of them an adult who had once been in conflict with the board, a shop owner who refused to sell his storefront, an engineer who reported a faulty drainage system, an accountant who suspected the reserve fund had been drained, a former board member who challenged Lenora directly. Each of them had eventually left the area after being threatened or financially ruined, and none of their disappearances had ever raised a single official question. Lenora entered wearing her black robe and set a land transfer document on the table, promising that if Grant signed it, she would cancel his death sentence, allow him to stay in his main house for 30 days, pay him $200,000, and publicly announce that he had been shown mercy. Grant asked why she needed a signature at all if her court truly held the authority to seize his property outright, and for a brief moment her composure cracked because the truth was that Red Summit still required paperwork that at least appeared voluntary. She let slip that a company representative would arrive by 5 that evening to collect the signed transfer, and that if Grant refused, she intended to forge his signature and produce a video suggesting he had confessed willingly. Grant deliberately drew the conversation out, and in her arrogance, Lenora began to boast, describing how the board had bought influence with local police through donations, how 4 homeowners had already been forced out permanently, how no prosecutor cared about what they dismissed as ordinary neighborhood disputes, how every resident in Briarwood feared her, and how the original recordings of every fake trial were locked in a records room beside her office. Every word reached Tessa's team in real time. Meanwhile, Bethany had been ordered to prepare the forged transfer document, and while searching for a template, she stumbled onto an internal message in which Lenora and Everett discussed pinning everything on her, claiming the secretary had acted alone in creating the seal and the fraudulent paperwork. Realizing she was being set up to serve prison time in place of the people actually giving the orders, Bethany grabbed a backup hard drive, the original minute books, and the key to the records room, then sent an anonymous tip to the county prosecutor's office, unaware that it would first be forwarded to a local officer who had accepted association donations for years. Wade received a warning that someone inside the clubhouse was leaking information, and Lenora ordered the entire building sealed. She returned to Grant with a camera, demanding he read a pre-written confession, and when he refused, she set a stun weapon on the table and warned that a civil death sentence could become genuinely painful if he continued to resist. Grant looked at her without flinching and told her that after months of playing judge, she seemed to have forgotten that a real judge would eventually watch every second of this recording. Furious, she smashed the camera against the floor, but at that exact instant, the basement lights cut out entirely, and Grant briefly assumed the federal team had begun its raid. Instead, backup power kicked in, and Wade's voice crackled over the speaker, announcing that a traitor was somewhere inside the building and that nobody was permitted to leave. On the security monitors, Lenora watched Bethany sprinting toward the records room with the hard drive clutched against her chest, and she gave the order to catch her, adding coldly that this time there should be no witness left behind. Bethany raced through a service corridor, while Wade sealed the main doors, knowing the clubhouse had a maintenance exit near the pump room, whose key was kept inside the security office. She hid the hard drive inside a rolling file cart and doubled back toward the administrative wing, but 2 security guards spotted her, and she claimed Lenora had ordered the files moved down to the detention level. As they turned to verify the instruction by radio, Bethany pulled the fire alarm, and the automatic fire doors sealed shut temporarily, cutting the security team in half. In the strobing red light of the alarm, Grant used a sliver of metal hidden inside his belt buckle to work free of his plastic restraints, and rather than force the door, he pried open the electronic lock panel and shorted the circuit, releasing all 3 detention rooms at once. The adjoining storage room, empty of people but full of confiscated belongings, held passports, phones, car keys, ownership certificates, bank records, and signed silence agreements, stacked on open shelving. And Grant used a small camera to photograph every shelf before moving on. One box bore the name Dale Whitmore and contained medication, a wallet, and a house transfer signed under obvious duress. And Grant understood immediately that this man had been held for 19 hours before being forced to sell his home far below its market value. Grant reached the upper hallway just as Bethany was cornered near the storage office, and he triggered a fire extinguisher to blind the cameras and the guards with a wall of white powder, then pulled her into a mechanical room. Bethany confessed that she had helped prepare dozens of fabricated citations and false minutes, but insisted she had learned only 2 months earlier that people were actually being detained against their will. She handed Grant the encryption key to the hard drive, which contained recordings of the fake trials, emails, ordering residents to be coerced, records of the money, transfers, the full Red Summit contract, a list of officers and inspectors who had accepted payments, a draft plan to forge, Grant's signature and video of all 12 board members raising their hands to approve what they had called his civil death sentence. Grant asked if she was prepared to testify, and Bethany answered that she would, provided they survived the night. Since the concrete walls of the basement blocked any signal, they agreed Grant would climb through a maintenance shaft toward the control room on the roof, where a satellite uplink could reach Tessa directly while Bethany returned to stall Lenora by pretending she wanted to negotiate. Bethany told Lenora she had hidden the hard drive somewhere only she knew, and Lenora promised leniency if she revealed the location, but Bethany demanded a written statement confirming every decision had come from the full board rather than from her alone. Lenora laughed at the request, though Everett recognized immediately what Bethany was actually doing, and he urged Lenora to have her seized at once. Meanwhile, inside the control room, Grant accessed the association's server and found a folder labeled Final Dispositions listing 17 additional properties. Lenora intended to seize over the following 2 years, using the exact same playbook of manufactured violations, fake trials, secret detention, and forced sales, with Grant's 94 acres representing only the largest prize on the list. He began uploading everything he could find, and the progress bar climbed to 67% before Wade noticed the unusual data activity and cut the internet connection. Grant switched to the satellite antenna, and the bar climbed to 91% as Wade broke through the control room door. Grant hit the final key before Wade could reach him, and the screen displayed the words "Upload complete." 14 miles away, Tessa Rowland opened the first file, a recording that showed all 12 board members raising their hands to authorize the detention, seizure, and permanent removal of a man named Grant Mercer. She turned to her tactical team and said they were no longer investigating a troublesome homeowners association, and she placed the arrest order on the table, announcing that they were about to dismantle an organized criminal enterprise. Wade dragged Grant back into the courtroom to continue the broadcast. Lenora refused to abandon, believing that if the crowd watched him surrender, no other resident would ever dare defy the board again. Grant stood at the defendant's stand with his wrists bound, while Bethany was held at the back of the room and the 12 board members sat above him on their raised platform. Lenora announced that the proceeding was resuming after what she called an act of sabotage, and she demanded Grant sign the transfer in front of every witness present. Grant asked instead to hear his charges read aloud, and when Everett handed him the list, he began asking one question after another. What law defined rebellion against a homeowners association as a crime? What agency authorized Wade to make an arrest? Who had appointed Lenora as a judge? Where had the courthouse seal actually come from? Which account received the fines that had been collected? Why had Red Summit paid $2 million in advance of any legal transfer? The room began to murmur, and Lenora ordered his microphone cut, but Grant spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear anyway, telling the crowd that she was not putting him on trial, she was selling something that had never belonged to her. Losing her composure entirely, Lenora declared that she had built Briarwood and decided who got to live there, who got to run a business there, and who had to disappear. Grant asked whether all 12 members had voted to approve that, and Lenora turned proudly to the board and confirmed that every decision had been unanimous. Unaware that the camera system Grant had quietly restored moments earlier was now broadcasting far beyond the clubhouse walls, straight to a federal server. He pressed further, asking whether all 12 knew about the detention rooms, and Lenora answered that they called it the compliance wing. He asked about the seized property, and she called it punishment. He asked about the forged signature, and she said it was only necessary when a resident failed to understand what was good for the community. Everett realized too late that she was confessing on the record, and he lunged for the control panel to cut the broadcast, but Bethany blocked him, seized the microphone, and announced to the room that people had been held prisoner beneath, by their feet, and that she possessed every file to prove it. Adult residents throughout the room began to stand. One recognized a missing neighbor's car sitting in the garage bay outside. An accountant spotted the name of Corinne's shell company flashing across the screen. A former serviceman demanded the doors be opened only to find security blocking every exit. Lenora warned that anyone attempting to leave would be treated as an accomplice to Grant, a threat that instantly stripped away whatever moral authority she still believed she held. Grant told her calmly that she had just turned 60 witnesses into hostages. She ordered Wade to drag Grant back to the basement and force the signature by any means necessary, and when Wade hesitated, sensing the situation had spiraled beyond control, she reminded him that his security company would collapse. Financially, if the deal fell through, then signed a new order, authorizing what she called all necessary coercive measures. Grant looked at the freshly inked signature and told her to keep it safe because it would soon become the most important piece of evidence in a very different kind of trial. From outside came the low rhythm of helicopter blades, and Lenora smiled, assuming the Red Summit representatives had finally arrived. Through the window, however, the vehicles pulling up were not marked with any mining company logo, but with federal plates, and Tessa Rowland stepped out flanked by a tactical team and federal prosecutor Adrian Pike. A voice over a loudspeaker announced that federal law enforcement had surrounded the building and ordered every exit unlocked immediately. Lenora turned to her board and declared that in her courtroom she still held the highest authority and that no one would open a single door. Tessa gave her 30 seconds. Lenora ordered Wade to position his men around the room, but many of them had already heard her confession broadcast live and had no interest in confronting federal agents on her behalf, and 3 set down their weapons without a word. Everett urged Lenora to open the doors and claimed the entire event was a harmless mediation exercise, betting that her robe, her seal, and her paperwork might create enough confusion to buy time to destroy evidence. And she ordered Corinne to wipe the servers, but financial investigator Nolan Price had already locked remote access from outside the building. The federal team breached a side entrance and moved in 3 directions at once, one securing Grant and Bethany, one containing the security detail, and one protecting the server room and archives. Tessa entered the courtroom just as Lenora sat rigid on her raised chair, striking her gavel and shouting that this was an unlawful intrusion into a legitimate proceeding, and Tessa placed a search warrant on the table and told her they were not intruding on a courtroom, they were stepping into a crime scene. Grant's restraints were cut, and when Tessa asked who had given the order for his arrest, he did not point only at Lenora. He pointed at the camera overhead and said all 12 of them had just answered that question themselves. Adrian Pike read the preliminary charges aloud. Conspiracy to commit extortion, unlawful imprisonment, forgery of judicial process, unauthorized use of a government seal, obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, wire fraud, witness, intimidation, conspiracy to forge a property deed, and participation in an organized criminal enterprise. Lenora insisted the board was immune because they were performing management duties, and Adrian answered simply that a homeowners association could fine a lawn, but it could not build a prison. Tessa ordered all 12 board members down from the platform. Wade tried slipping toward a rear exit and was stopped immediately. Corinne had hidden a flash drive in her shoe, but the scanner found it instantly. Everett claimed he had only ever served as legal counsel until Bethany produced an email in which he personally drafted instructions for coercing confessions. The remaining members began turning on Lenora one after another, while she insisted furiously that every single one of them had voted for it. Deputies moved down the line, and the sound of handcuffs closing echoed again and again through a room that had once been built to make other people feel that exact fear. Search teams opened the locked garages and recovered 3 unlawfully seized vehicles, 2 safes filled with cash 46, suspicious property files, equipment used to forge official seals, receipts documenting payments to public officials, recordings of coercive interrogations, and the list of 17 future targets. In the basement, they collected biological evidence, personal belongings, and detention logs confirming that former occupants had not stayed of their own free will. As Lenora was let out in handcuffs, she turned to Grant and told him he had won nothing because no one could ever prove exactly who had ordered what. Bethany stepped forward behind Tessa, holding the order log every page, carrying Lenora's own signature, and said quietly that she had written it all down. For the first time that day, Lenora said nothing at all. In the weeks that followed, Briarwood Crest was placed under independent temporary administration, and every fine seizure and board resolution issued under Lenora's leadership was suspended. Nolan Price combed through 18,000 pages of financial records and discovered that association dues had funded the construction of the detention rooms, paid Wade's private security firm, purchased surveillance equipment, compensated Everett for drafting fraudulent orders, delivered cash to local inspectors, and quietly repurchased victims' homes through shell companies, designed to disguise the connection back to Corinne, who had structured every transfer into smaller payments, specifically to avoid triggering scrutiny. In total, more than $4,600,000 had been diverted through this scheme. Investigators located the residents who had vanished over the previous years, and each one told a version of the same story. Dale Whitmore described being held in the basement for 19 hours, denied his medication, and released only after signing away his home. Marissa Calder, an environmental engineer, said she had been threatened after discovering that the association's wastewater system was contaminating the local water supply. Gordon Bellamy, a former treasurer, produced original financial records that Lenora had tried and failed to destroy years earlier. Every account followed the identical pattern. The board manufactured a violation, escalated the fines, staged a fake hearing, isolated the target from their neighbors, threatened arrest, forced a sale far below market value, and repurchased the property through a shell entity. And Grant Rekatsayandaman realized his own farm had simply been the largest version of a scheme they had already perfected many times before. From custody, Lenora insisted through new counsel that Grant had entrapped the board, that the detention rooms were merely relaxation spaces, that the death sentence language had been symbolic, that residents had joined the hearings voluntarily, that Bethany had stolen and altered the records herself, and that Red Summit Minerals had nothing to do with the seizure of his land. She tried to fracture the case into a series of smaller civil disputes to avoid a unified conspiracy charge, forcing Adrian Pike to prove that all 12 members had acted together with full knowledge of what they were doing. The breakthrough came when Grant recalled that during the stage trial, each board member had used a personal tablet to cast an electronic vote, and technicians recovered the voting server intact. The data showed 12 people voting to fund the construction of the detention rooms, to pay the security team, to seize vehicles, to falsify maps, to force Grant's signature, to issue what they called his civil death sentence, to destroy documents if police arrived, and to shift blame onto Bethany. Each vote stamped with a timestamp, a device identifier, and a personal authentication code that made deniability impossible. A deleted audio file was also recovered, in which Lenora could be heard telling the board that if everyone signed together, no single person would ever have to answer for it alone. Red Summit Minerals offered Grant $6 million privately to keep the company's name out of any civil litigation, and he refused without hesitation, telling their representative that paying for property the seller never owned was not an accident but a decision, and the company was placed under its own separate investigation for pushing the association toward seizure, despite knowing the ownership dispute was unresolved. A federal grand jury eventually issued an indictment running 138 pages, naming all 12 board members in a single unified conspiracy, with Lenora identified as the architect of the scheme, Everett as the legal engineer who gave it the appearance of legitimacy, Wade as the people enforcer who carried out its violence, Corinne as the financier who moved its money, and the remaining 8 members as approvers and beneficiaries who profited from every seizure they authorized. A trial date was set, and this time the room would hold a real judge, a real jury, and doors that Lenora Voss no longer controlled. The trial opened under the presiding authority of federal judge Miriam Halbrook, 61 years old, known for a courtroom manner as precise as it was unforgiving. On the very first day, she barred the defense from referring to their invented tribunal simply as a community court, unless they added the word self-styled beforehand, telling the room plainly that a wooden gavel does not automatically make a courtroom. The defense argued that the language in Lenora's documents had been symbolic rather than literal, that Grant never actually lost his land and therefore suffered no completed harm, that the security team misunderstood their orders, that the board had trusted Everett's legal advice in good faith, and that Lenora had only ever wanted to protect property values for the community she loved. Everett, in turn, claimed Lenora had coerced him into drafting the documents. Wade insisted he was simply performing his assigned security duties. Corinne claimed ignorance of where the money actually originated, and the remaining 8 members each testified that they had never actually read the materials before, casting their votes. Bethany Sloan became the first witness to connect every piece of the conspiracy into a single narrative. She presented the order log bearing Lenora's signature internal emails discussing the detention of residents' recordings of the staged trials, minutes from planning meetings, the list of future targets, the plan to make her the scapegoat, and the voting data implicating all 12 members equally. When defense counsel accused her of complicity since she had helped draft some of the very documents now used against the board, Bethany admitted her role honestly, but explained she had never once been permitted to make a decision of her own. Asked why she had kept the evidence rather than destroying it, as instructed, she answered that Lenora had taught every person in that building how paperwork could be used to destroy someone, and she had decided that paperwork could also be used to save them. Grant's own testimony followed a plain, unembellished chronology: the letter announcing his civil death, the invasion of his farm, the destruction of his camera, his unlawful arrest, the threat made with a stun weapon, the pressure to sign away his land. Lenora's own recorded confession, and the Reddit discovery of other victims' belongings stacked in the basement. When the prosecution played the clip in which Lenora declared she alone decided who had to disappear, the courtroom fell completely silent. Defense counsel asked whether Grant had deliberately dragged out the confrontation to trap her into incriminating herself, and he answered simply that he had never told her to build a jail, never told her to forge a seal, and had only ever given her the room to explain in her own words exactly what she had done. Against her attorney's advice, Lenora chose to testify in her own defense, convinced she could persuade the jury that Briarwood needed a strong hand to guide it. When Adrian asked whether a homeowners association possessed any legal authority to impose a prison sentence, she deflected the question entirely. When asked whether Grant Mercer was even a member of the association, she was forced to admit that he was not. When asked why a forged signature had ever been necessary, she answered that it was required because he had selfishly refused what was best for the community. A response that effectively confirmed the motive of extortion the prosecution had spent months building. Adrian displayed the Red Summit contract on the courtroom screen, her signature sitting directly beneath a clause promising that the association would deliver Grant's land ahead of schedule. After days of deliberation, the jury returned, and one by one the 12 defendants rose to hear their names called. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Each of the 12 board members was convicted of conspiracy to commit extortion, along with at least 3 additional charges apiece. Lenora no longer sat above the room on a raised platform. She stood between 2 federal officers level at last, with the very people she had once controlled from a height she had built for herself. Before sentencing, Lenora sent Grant a letter offering to disclose money hidden overseas if he would ask the court for leniency on her behalf. He never replied. Instead, he forwarded the letter directly to Adrian Pike, and it became evidence supporting an additional charge of obstruction of justice. The courtroom was full on the day of sentencing, and Judge Miriam Halbrook ordered the original sign the association had nailed to Grant's front door placed before the defendants, the sign that read "Property seized by the homeowners association." She explained that it stood as a symbol of 12 people who had granted themselves the authority to erase another person's life, telling them plainly that they had not committed an administrative error. They had constructed a private system of punishment built on fear, money, and captivity in place of the law. Lenora Voss received 31 years in federal prison as the architect of the conspiracy who had built the fake court, ordered the arrests, directed the extortion, and orchestrated the forged documents, along with forfeiture of every dollar she had gained through it. Everett Rourke received 24 years for designing the fraudulent legal framework, drafting the arrest and detention paperwork, and instructing others on how to destroy evidence. Wade Hollister received 22 years for leading the raid on Grant's farm, personally overseeing his detention, managing the secret basement prison, and threatening numerous victims into silence. Corinne Maddox received 19 years for laundering association funds, operating the network of shell companies, and hiding the $2 million advance from Red Summit Minerals. 4 board members who had approved the seizure of resident property each received sentences ranging from 11 to 16 years, having voted to authorize confiscation, accepted financial benefits from the scheme, and signed off on fabricated minutes. The remaining 4 members who had served on what the association called its community jury each received sentences ranging from 7 to 12 years, having participated in the staged trials, approved unlawful detentions, assisted in intimidating witnesses, and voted to convict a man they knew had never belonged to their association in the first place. Beyond the prison terms, the court ordered restitution to every victim, the reversal of 46 coerced property transactions, the forced sale of the ringleader's personal assets to fund those repayments, a lifetime ban on any of the 12 holding a position in residential governance again, referral of the Red Summit matter to a separate prosecution, and a formal investigation into every public official found to have accepted payment from the association. Given the chance to speak, Lenora did not apologize to Grant. She told the court that Briarwood would collapse without her guidance. Grant, in turn, was permitted to deliver a victim statement, and he stood and told the room that Briarwood was not close to collapsing because it lacked her. It had come close to collapsing because too many people believed they needed her at all. He did not ask for a harsher sentence. He asked only that the full case record be made public, so that no other homeowners association anywhere could ever quietly copy what Lenora Voss had built. 6 months later, the clubhouse that had once housed a fake courtroom and a hidden prison had been converted into a records center and an open meeting hall. The basement detention rooms were demolished entirely. Every future association meeting would be recorded on video, every major expense subject to independent audit, and every resident forced into a coerced sale was given the choice to reclaim their property or accept financial compensation. Bethany Sloan went on to work with an organization supporting victims of civil abuse of power. Grant recovered every vehicle and every possession that had been taken from him. Red Summit Minerals abandoned its extraction rights entirely and was ordered to pay for the environmental damage its early operations had already caused. Grant chose not to join the new governing board that replaced the old one, believing that a person who had just spent months fighting to dismantle unchecked power should not immediately reach for that same power himself. Instead, he opened a portion of his land to create a legally recognized public right-of-way, ensuring that no single resident could ever again use control of that road as a weapon against a neighbor. One morning, walking past the very gate Wade's men had once cut through, he noticed the old scratch marks still visible where the chain had been forced apart, and he kept the original death sentence document, framing it and hanging it in his office. Beneath it, he placed a copy of the real federal judgment, and where the association's forged sentence ran only 7 pages and carried no legal weight whatsoever. The actual judgment ran 312 pages, bore an authentic federal seal, and listed the names of all 12 defendants for the permanent record. Looking at the two documents side by side, Grant told Tessa that Lenora had tried to use a fake court to erase his name entirely, and Tessa answered that in the end it was a real court that had written all 12 of their names down for good. Outside on the road, the old sign that once declared the property seized by the Homeowners Association still stood where it had been planted, but the original words had been struck through, and beneath them someone had painted a single new line that read, "Federal evidence, false authority, true sentence."